Welcome to the Anarchist News Review from Freedom Press, freedompress.org.uk, freedomnews.org.uk. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gordon, joined tonight by anarchist historian, writer, and commentator Mike Finn, and Freedom columnist, political scientist, and one-time class war parliamentary candidate John Bigger. Good evening to you both.
Hello.
We've got at least three topics try to delve into tonight. Oh God, I'm starting to sound like ChatGPT. We're going to look at the local elections, at the gains for reform, the losses for labor, and its consistent insistence to shoot itself in the foot. We're just past the 1st of May. Worldwide, there have been a widespread demonstrations between London and Jakarta, between Rio de Janeiro and Istanbul. We look at the background of Mayday, the history of Mayday, the anarchist Mayday, and why it's still significant today. And finally, just following on with the continuing campaign of direct action and micro sabotage, non-violence interventions in Britain against today we've seen Barclays targeted at several occasions overnight by Shut the System, and also around the war on Gaza. So let's start with UK politics and the results of the regional elections. I mean, what's more depressing, the power gained by reform or Labour's insistence to hand it over to them so
I think
enthusiastically? John.
Uri's cutting out a little bit, so
Well,
I think
what
I get the gist.
are we back on?
Yeah, I
Yep.
think so. I think, I mean, obviously those two things are linked, aren't they? And I think one of the astonishing things that has happened in the last 9 months or whatever since Labour won that massive majority is that they took a choice. They made a choice to move in a reform direction, a choice that they didn't have to make. They've got a majority that is huge, and they made a political choice to ignore the fact that they have a parliamentary majority that gets them the right to change the country in the image that they want the country to look like. And instead, they chose to go in a completely different direction from their history and from many of the standards and principles of their members and their followers in heading towards reform. And now they're in a situation where the voters have not liked that, and actually reform are doing well out of it, so that they are now in a position, if there was a general election today or tomorrow, because for Thursday tomorrow, if there was a general election tomorrow, they would be in a position where they could potentially lose, and Nigel Farage would be in Downing Street. So now they've got themselves into a position where they kind of have to ward off reform. Whereas they started the situation in government in Downing Street not having to do that. So they have undoubtedly kicked themselves in both feet. I mean, it's utterly lewd. Can you kick yourself in both feet? Anyway, you shoot yourself, don't you? Sorry, this is long COVID brain fog. You've got just the right person on to talk live about this stuff. But that's how I feel about it. That they have moved themselves into this position where they are now inevitably going to have to ward off reform, and they have a choice of how they do this. I think they're going to go in the wrong direction, carry on doing what they're doing by trying to appease people who potentially might vote for reform, when in fact they could use their majority constructively to rearrange this country in a way that people might flock back to them. And it's that lack of vision and that lack of principle that is driving our politics, and has actually been driving our politics regardless of who's in power for quite some time. If you look back over the last 10 years, since that, if last 9 years, since that Brexit vote. We have, as a country, our politicians, our politics has been buffeted about from pillar to post with nobody. Even now, we can look at Theresa May and Liz Truss and say, well, they couldn't control events. But we could also look at prime ministers with healthy majorities who ended up not being able to control events as well. There is, in a sense, a crisis in our politics because our politicians are absolutely rubbish at doing the things they used to be able to do, which is you've got a big majority, you take over the country, you do what you like. You know, this idea of an elected dictatorship, that has now gone. We've got a government with a majority that implies elected dictatorship, and they're all at sea. So who's going to benefit from that? Someone with the gift of the gab, basically, Nigel Farage, a man who is so simplistic and so fake. He couldn't argue his way out of a paper bag if you actually ask him some decent questions. But he is saying the common sense things that ordinary people are kind of warming to. That's my rant done for a little while. Someone come in.
Can I jump in on that if that's
Yeah.
okay? Because so many points that you raised there, John, that I think are absolutely spot on and scary, if I'm honest. Even though we're anarchists and we're not, we're not bystanders to parliamentary politics because it has an impact on us like it does on everybody else. So we're not bystanders to it. We're not bystanders to regional, local politics. But it's scary. It's scary hours. And come back to your point about this issue around Labour don't have a vision. Very clearly, they didn't have their own vision when they came into office, other than, to essentially mimic the politics of the right and then increasingly the far right, which is, as you say, open this space for reform where, well, it's the old analogy that used to get made in the coalition era as to why the Lib Dems were going to suffer coming out of that. If you actually like what the coalition did, if you like austerity, if you like all that horrible stuff, then vote for the full fat Pepsi, to use a corporate analogy. Don't bother with the diet, and that's kind of where Labour, I think, finds itself. It finds itself in a space where they've wrapped themselves in the national flag to the nth degree, even prior to being elected, and they're in a space now where it's like, well, and also if we look back to, I mean, I know you're all over this, but we look back to the last general election. In many places, they won because the vote was split between two parties of the right. We know that. So, and there's a complete lack of, well, principle, as you've said, maybe confidence. But I think one of the other things is also, and this is something that scares me a lot, just in general, and probably a lot of other people, is just, we are anarchists, we are collectivists as well. We are socialists. We are the narratives, or the kind of narratives that, if you like, the media space or the public sphere now allows in terms of collectives. The only collective you can talk about is the nation. That's the only collective you're allowed to talk about. We're going to talk about, as you already said, we're going to talk about Mayday later, but you wouldn't know that there's been in mainstream press coverage in the UK that's been something of significance in the last week or so. You would know about VE Day. You would know about that, and you would know about World War II and things that happened 80 years ago that, have become more alive now than they were when I was a kid in the 80s, and people were alive who remembered the war. It's been mobilized in different directions. And you saw that in the visual imaging of Labour, obviously, in the explicit imagery of Labour in the build-up to the election. The fact that they adopted the national flag, they stuck it on the membership card, they were desperate to have all this symbolism. And that's the only collective that you are allowed to talk about in those terms. You're not allowed to talk about trade unions, maybe, or radical unionism, or any of the kinds of things that we're interested in. So that kind of thing scares me because, as you say, John, it doesn't leave people with a lot of avenues, does it? Except they're certainly not the Labour Party, but people in general.
Although, I mean, I don't know if this is cynical, but we could trace a lot of that nationalism already to the Blair years. And we could, the real cynics would argue that the Labour Party was founded in order to be the graveyard of the working class movement. But certainly there is a long history of social democrats having this is exactly what they're good at. And this is why, as anarchists, of course, we think that the parliamentary path to socialism is a dead end and has been for a long time. But now, I mean, I think that it's been described like that if there's sort of this kind of ratchet effect of politics moving constantly to the right, it's the parliamentary left or the Democrats that acts as the ratchet itself, that just doesn't allow it to return. They're actually performing the positive function of redrawing those goalposts, and I think that's extremely dangerous.
I
Not not
agree.
not just in terms of Labour ever winning again, not just in terms of going the opposite way of anti-capitalist politics. I mean, in terms of a threat to nominal democracy
Yeah,
and
yeah.
representative government.
I think that there's always the threat of that happening, isn't there, with social democracy? But what's happening here, I think, is slightly different in the fact that often that happens because they feel as though they're threatened by the press or a future election or whatever. When you're starting with 170 odd majority at the beginning of your 5-year term, you should not be feeling like that. They are doing it without any duress. They are doing it without any kind of force propelling them to do it. They actively went in that direction. They made a
Well, that
choice
brings
to
us
do it.
again to the question of why. I mean, is it because they came into power with nothing but opposition to socialism and Corbynism in their backpack? Is that
Well,
simply the entire ideological baggage they've even brought?
I think there might be some really simple explanations. It's probably more than just one thing. But one of the things that is significant about this current government is the total lack of experience in a political sphere of Keir Starmer. He's entered Downing Street, tabula rasa style, and he doesn't know. He's got no foundation of politics, and you've got someone like the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, who's steeped in a socialism, a trade unionism, a history there that she will understand politics much better than he will, and so he's entered as a manager, hasn't he? And almost right at the beginning, he's seen that he can't change things, that he's having trouble getting things done. And prime ministers don't blame themselves for that. It's always somebody else's fault. So there will already be lots of tension in that cabinet. There's already rumours that he's going to be making changes to the structure of government, maybe getting rid of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, just at the moment that Donald Trump slaps 100% tariffs on the film industry. You think, is this guy paying any attention? Does this guy understand the way government works? Does he understand what he's got the power to do? Literally, he's got the power to change the country. Coming back a little bit, I apologize. Coming back a little bit to my point about him having this majority, and picking up on what Mike said about last year's election and the way the right was split, it reminds me so much of the 1983 election. Now we can criticize Margaret Thatcher and till the cows come home. I had a dream about her the other day where I was incredibly rude to her face to face, and immediately got tackled by a security guard and found
Well,
myself
if not in life, then in the next life. Here you
why
go.
am I dreaming about Margaret Thatcher? Anyway, it's terrible. It's because I was teaching about her. Anyway, in 1983, the brand new SDP, which had broken off from the Labour Party, formed an alliance with the Liberal Party. They got 25% of the vote, and Labour ended up going down to 27% of the vote. The left was split so much that even though Margaret Thatcher's vote share went down because she lost votes to the SDP Liberal Alliance as well, massive majority, she used that to crush the miners, change trade union law, privatize industry. And it is that election rather than 1979 that cemented her and her government as the thing we know it is and that it was. And right now, that's because that division on the left gave her political space. It widened the political space for her so much. She could control her cabinet better, she could control parliament better, and she could crush collectivism like the unions. And here we are with a brand new Labour government with a massive majority. The right is split. And what is it doing? It's chasing the right. Utterly ludicrous. These
Well, I
people.
mean, I guess part of the structural game has been to make sure that when Labour gets that kind of majority, it's not under a person like Jeremy Corbyn, who might have, provided that left-wing populism
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is perhaps a legitimate aspiration because it's impossible to get, right? So of course things align in a way that when that majority comes, the head of Labour would be someone like Keir Starmer. And
yeah.
that's that's the way these processes happen, right? We have nothing to hope for from there.
I mean, Corbyn came close, remember, didn't he? So, he did come close in 2017. He came close to defeating Theresa May out of office, at least. Maybe he wouldn't have got into Downing Street, but he came as close as anyone could, I think. And I don't think that people disliked his policies either. I think,
Who cares about what people think? What, right? I mean,
no,
when
I
when
mean,
I mean, but it was the internal machinery of the Labour Party that was working
oh
against
yes, of
him. It
course,
was it
yeah,
was
yeah,
something that, the Labour Party has reached a stage where it has antibodies
yeah,
as
but
an institution against a leader like Corbyn, which
yeah.
is, which is to be expected.
Yeah, exactly, is to be expected. And why weren't they battling that? Why didn't they do anything to neutralize it? Because Tony Blair
Because
came
they're Marxists.
to the leadership. What does that mean? That they were too kind? What do we mean? I mean,
Well, I think they had too much faith in those institutions that they thought that they could change from the inside.
possibly, possibly. I think that there's a kind of tightrope that you've got to if you're on the left of the Labour Party and you get the leadership, there's a tightrope you've got to walk in trying to keep your party together. And the right is ruthless, absolutely ruthless. But if they weren't ready for that and they weren't prepared for it, it's on Corbyn and his supporters, not on anybody else. If they didn't know that was going to happen, you know, get real.
Yeah, well, it's not there, Mike.
So if I just jump in there as well, like, just in terms of what Yori was saying about ratchet, that word ratchet, we probably all know this, but there was a famous quote by Keith Joseph in the 70s, who was Thatcher's kind of intellectual eminence grise, and he famously said that what British politics had been locked in since 1945 to that point was a socialist ratchet, and whichever party came into office, there was a gradual drift leftward. That was their argument, whether you believe it or not. That's what they argued. And Thatcher was meant to be the figure that would smash that socialist ratchet and, if you like, impose a conservative ratchet in the other direction. And it's easy to take these quotes and be a bit trite and say that actually happened. Well, going to John's point about the 83 election, actually that parliament, that 83 parliament, is more or less when that happens in terms of that ratchet is reversed. If that ratchet was even real, it's reversed, and it moves into a space where, the Kinnock era was an attempt at accommodation with the Tories way before Blair. Blair comes through during Kinnock, obviously he's there during John Smith and so on. But then the other thing I think to think about, come back to your point, where does this come from? Why is Labour like this? Because I think as anarchists, we all agree, don't we, that,
It's the scorpion and the frog. It's in its nature. What?
Yeah.
That's the nature of the beast.
We always feel that way, right? But I think coming to John's point as well about Corbynism and what was in Corbynism and what people liked and so on, and this point you make about antibodies, I think one of the interesting things of the Labour right is how much the Labour right has changed over the last 40 years. And if you take like somebody who in the sort of somebody I've worked on in the past, but somebody who in the 50s was seen as the kind of intellectual figure behind the Labour right was a guy called Anthony Crossland. He was a Secretary of State for Education in the 60s. He was Foreign Secretary in the Callan in the 70s, but he was a big figure on the Labour right. He was the intellectual figure, if you like. In his book, Future of Socialism, there's a famous line in that where he says there must always be in socialists, in the blood of socialists, must run a trace of the anarchist and the libertarian. And he doesn't mean some anarcho-capitalism. He doesn't mean some privatization thing. He's talking about like the good life, different kinds of ideas of equality, democratization, all this sort of stuff. So he's talking about interesting things. That's alien to this Labour Party. They have no understanding of that right. I'm not nostalgic for a better Labour right. I agree with you, Yori. There is a scorpion and the frog syndrome here. But I do think that it's really interesting. What's really interesting to me in the last few weeks and even days is how many of the old Blairites are like, what the hell is Starmer doing? That's interesting to me, because I agree with you too, Yuri. I think the Blairites laid the path for what is happening now, absolutely. And I think particularly around the nationalism stuff, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, armed forces day, all that stuff in the 2000s. But when you've got someone like John McTiernan, who worked for Blair, saying on social media, what the hell is Starmer doing? He's saying, but he's saying this is, he's criticising the briefing that's coming out of them, that they need to double down on the direction. That shows you how much has changed in a short period of time, that even the Blairites don't want to own this, which I find fascinating, just that, even in the last short period of time.
Yeah, there's a real, the Labour Party's in a pickle, basically. But I think coming back to the election and thinking a bit further forward, I think that, so the local elections did involve Reform making great gains and taking control of some councils and getting the Greater Lincolnshire mayor. And I've got family in Lincolnshire still, and I've been hearing about what some people have been saying and stuff about it. But I think the significant result was the by-election, Runcorn and Helsby, because that's a parliamentary seat. But also, it's just one extra parliamentary seat. So their voice in Parliament, at least, is quite small. Their voice on the media is just astonishing. They control the media narrative at the moment, or at least the media narrative kind of amplifies their voice. Let's put it
And
that
they
way.
amplified their voice rather than, let's say, the Greens or
Exactly.
SNP or Plaid or whoever else, right?
Exactly. And also, we should bear in mind that the elections last week were in England only, most of it in shire counties where you would imagine a strong right-wing voice, mainly Conservative traditionally. But the Conservatives did incredibly well when those councils were up for grabs 4 years ago. If you remember, it was right after the COVID vaccine bounce. Boris Johnson was doing okay. We didn't know about the parties yet, all of that sort of stuff. And so you'd expect the Conservatives to drop a little bit. Obviously, they've dropped off a cliff, and Reform have mainly taken their place. It's still a split right, really. Reform are taking votes from Labour, but they only won that Runcorn and Helsby seat by 6 votes. So if 3 Reform voters had voted Labour, it would have been a tie. So, it's
just on that, John, if I can ask
yeah.
you a question. How much of that do you think, this framing that we've been talking about, that Labour have been trying to mimic Reform and it hasn't paid off for them, sort of thing? How much do you think, the general, and this goes to the point that both of you have made really about what's happened over the last 9 years, how much do you think what's happening with Reform and the Tories specifically, particularly given, as you say, mapping against 4 years ago, what happened coming out of COVID, how much do you think there's an element of the Tories did this whole thing in sabotaging the kind of norms, if you like, of parliamentary democracy under Boris Johnson? They did the whole thing about prorogation. We'll tell whatever nonsense we want to say. We'll
Lies.
That's the word I was looking for, Yori. We'll do this. This will be our stock in trade. We will do this. We won't just mislead. We won't just obfuscate. We'll just talk absolute. And we'll overpromise, and therefore we'll inevitably underdeliver, right? We'll inflame these expectations, and to use a horrible xenophobic, racist phrase that they use, stop the boats, we'll come up with these slogans that we can't possibly deliver on, but we're not really about government. What we're really about is just sloganeering. And actually, that's riding the tiger, and Reform is that tiger, and they vet them effectively. Do you think there's anything in that, or do you think that's too easy?
There might well be something in that, and it plays into the idea that basically we've replaced one set of managers with another, that they're just managing events rather than controlling them. It's worth remembering that Rishi Sunak inherited a majority of around about 40. It was slightly less than that, but that's what Boris Johnson got in the 2019 election. That's a healthy majority. That Boris Johnson government should have been able to do everything in its manifesto. Okay, COVID came along, and he was a prat. So, obviously he was going to crash and burn at some point. And then Liz Truss came along, and she thought she owned the world by winning that leadership election. She There's evidence to suggest, I've been reading a book about her time in office recently, which is very entertaining. There's evidence to suggest that she thought winning that leadership election within the Conservative Party was some kind of recognition by the country at large that she was perfect for the job, and so she just entered Downing
By
Street.
God,
She could do what
why
she liked.
why just the country? God himself.
It's astonishing levels of arrogance. But I suppose if you're going to try to be prime minister, you kind of need that, I suppose. But we don't have great people. But Keir Starmer really pitched himself as a better manager than Rishi Sunak, didn't he? That was his whole thing. But that doesn't mean you have to ditch your principles and some of your policies, does it? Or
Yes,
change
it
them for
does,
new
John.
policies.
That's what happens to politicians. You
I'm
don't
I'm
become.
trying. Yeah, I'm trying not to be too cynical. But the other thing I wanted to say is that this is obviously being presented as a massive change that we have now, multi-party politics, and I can see that. But I still think first past the post favors two parties, and I still think it is incredibly difficult for a minor party to come in and overtake one of those two main parties. Labour did it 100 years ago, and maybe it's time that somebody else did it. Maybe it's a feature of the system, but I'm not convinced yet. I still remain hopeful that Nigel Farage will be seen as the ludicrous, sloganeering idiot that he is, a man who will, like do what populists do, basically, just say whatever he thinks at the time in the hope that people out there see it as common sense. But he's got form, hasn't he, for starting parties and then them getting taken over by the far right, and he disappears into the distance to start another one to disrupt things. I'm not sure that in office those reform candidates are going to do anything other than fail and look ridiculous in the long term, because politics is a long-term game. Parliamentary politics, an incredibly long-term thing, and I don't think he's got the qualities to carry on being the leader of the Reform Party as it grows and as it naturally will want to question the leadership, and people will naturally want to come up with their own policies. They're going to come into conflict with him, and we've already seen what happens when people come into conflict with him. They're no longer in the Reform Party. So there are some hints at a more positive future. But having said that, just to qualify that again, it is clear that they've taken a massive step forward. The next big issue to crop up in a year's time is the devolved elections, and they want to take control of the Welsh Parliament. If they take control of the Welsh Parliament and start running Wales, then I
Then
think,
things will get truly interesting.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and
Okay. Well,
terrifying.
let's pivot then from parliamentary politics to extra parliamentary politics and have a
Yes.
bit of a reminder about the 1st of May. And, we tried on Freedom to put out a global report with pics and info as soon as we could, but still into the week, today and as far as next week, we're still going to see reports coming in from Mayday events and, literally hundreds of cities across, at least 5 continents, 6 continents. Are there 6 continents? Well, it depends if we count North and South America separately. But I think it was, and of course there was also the usual event in London, where our colleague Sam managed to flog at least 60 copies of the new issue of Freedom, Our Power, which is now out, and please check freedomnews.org.uk for those details. But we have that sort of A to B format of trade union marches and various communist groupuscles with less or more of a Stalinist or a Trotskyist or a Bordigist, or call it what you want, a tendency. You could do a bestiary of those types. And in all that, and of course, already since the sort of co-optation of May the 1st by the USSR in the 20th century, it gets forgotten that this is actually an anarchist day, founded, to commemorate the Haymarket martyrs, who were executed in Chicago. Yeah, as part of the repression that happened in the struggle of workers for the 8-hour day. Uh, in the very same year, and with the same very event that inspired the foundation of freedom, um, by Charlotte Wilson and Kropotkin that very same year. So, Mike, would you maybe take us a little bit into the past and the present, and connect up those anarchist roots of Mayday for us? I think, it's possible to say that uh, there are some countries in which those roots are thicker and more pronounced than in the UK. Maybe we could explain some of the reasons for that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a good little recap there, Yuri, on, what's been obfuscated and lost, really. And certainly if you're in the UK audience, we were talking before we came online. Actually, even the fact of May Day as a workers' holiday at all, really, in the UK is a message that's sort of gotten lost. A few years ago, not this VE Day anniversary, but a few years ago, the bank holiday was actually branded as the VE Day bank holiday. I think it was the 75th anniversary. And it was basically, yeah, let's just forget about May Day. VE Day is the thing. And that kind of points to what we were talking about earlier, is this displacement of alternative forms of collective with the nation. But coming back to the historical point, absolutely, within the labour movement, within the left, depending on how you bound the labour movement, but within the boundaries of the labour movement, the anarchist origins of Mayday, something we as anarchists talk about a little bit, to a wider audience is often forgotten. And, if we go back to 1886, which is the year you're talking about, and we go back to the Foundation of Freedom, we go back before that to what you're talking about, which is the Haymarket affair, that was an incident which took place in Chicago. It's a story well known to anarchists. There was a demonstration on, I think, May the 4th, held by the Working People's Association, which was basically this mass movement union. Albert Parsons, Lucy Parsons' husband, was involved. Proto-syndicalist organization, if you
August
like.
Spies, Louis
August
Ling.
Spies, Lewis Thing, all these big names, well, as they would become, because they were heavily involved in this. There was a general strike for the 8-hour day, which had been a demand in the American labor movement at that time. Obviously, the demonstration happens on the 4th. A bomb is thrown. The police obviously there's fire on the crowd, people are killed. At the same time, then you get a situation where basically the usual suspects are rounded up, and the usual suspects happen to be our anarchist friends, and they end up becoming the Haymarket martyrs after a trial, and they end up being executed. And this has a massive impact, across the board. It doesn't just impact in the US, this impacts all over the place. Obviously, Emma Goldman talks about reading this story later on, and the impact that this had on her reading about that. And you find that in the memoirs of a lot of anarchists in the later period, in the early 20th century. So this made a profound impact on them at the time, as you say, the likes of Wilson and Freedom as well. So it becomes a transnational thing. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that even in the immediate aftermath, this is also a time when we're not quite the pariahs in the labour movement that we go on to be later. So quite often, I think there's a shorthand done with in the early 1870s and the split in the First International, Marx v. Bakunin. And when that happens and the anarchists get kicked out of the First International, which is a bit too simplistic because they were only becoming anarchists at that time. That came out of that. But when that happens, then apparently we're asunder and we don't talk to each other, and then we hate each other forever, and there's no playing ball with each other. It's not as simple as that. As we know, there were revolutionary congresses through the 1880s into the 1890s, when you have the Second International, and eventually, yes, anarchists get prescribed from that again. But it was the Second International that wanted the May Day as a holiday, and to noted Haymarket and its role in that. So there was still an attempt to have a kind of pluralistic, if you like, socialist Labour holiday, if you like, when was a commemoration, and that really gathered force right the way through the period. As you say, it has more energy in some other places, e.g., in some of the places in the anarchist diaspora, if you like. I hate that phrase really because it implies Eurocentricity, but certainly in lots of places around the world, there is a lot more purchase for it than it
I
is
think
here.
there's a point to be made that, up until, the 20th century, anarchism was actually the dominant force in the labor movements in the colonial world. So if we're looking at, Mexico Mexico, Brazil, if we're looking at, North Africa, if we're looking at the kind of earliest socialist currents in, Philippines, Japan, it was the anarchists rather than the Marxists that had a very strong presence there. And I think it's in those countries who were still able to say neither Washington nor Moscow to a degree, that some of those anarchist roots have been preserved, as well as places where there is still a presence for anarchist unions, especially Spain, France,
Spain. Yeah.
and Latin America. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, to your point, you're absolutely right. I think when you talk about Latin America and Spain in particular, but as you say, across everywhere, 1880-ish through to 1914, that's the heyday, if you like, of global anarchism in many ways. But also particularly within syndicalist movements and proto and syndicalist organizations and so on, that fusion is really powerful. But as you say, it's left a legacy to the present, because you do still, I mean, yes, the CNT is in Spain now is not the CNT of, I don't know, 1934. But nonetheless, there is still a lived culture there. I have, as your typical cosplaying British person, worn a CNT t-shirt and been approached while I was in the CNT. Had these conversations in a way you would never get these sorts of conversations in Britain. So there's a different sort of experience and lived experience and shared memory. So, and I
Well,
think
now
just
there's
going
two
back to the
of them
Mayday
and they're
point, what's
fighting,
happened?
but
Yeah, absolutely. If we come back to the point about what happened to the memory of Mayday, what happened to the memory of where the holiday came from? Actually, if you look at Britain in particular, to go parochial again and come back to here, we were very late getting that holiday. I think I'm right in saying, John will know better than me, but I think it was under the Callaghan government that actually became a bank holiday. I think it was the late 70s that actually came in. So I think it's very late. It was controversial at the time because I think Michael Foot was pushing for it before he became leader and so on. So it was controversial. It was late and it was never deeply embedded in the UK because that kind of memory, even before Labour ceased to be on the meaningfully on the left, had been eviscerated and pummeled and punished, if you like. So it's a really challenging one to try and recover that history. I think that's a really big one that we need to do, just to try and educate people on the fact of what's possible in the future.
I mean, you can tell how different it is here for the fact that it always takes place on the Monday closest to May the 1st, rather than May the 1st itself. And also in the UK, in London anyway, I don't know about other places. It's basically a Stalinist event in London, isn't it? And a lot of a lot of trades councils up and down the country tend to have it on the nearest Saturday rather than May Day itself. The whole idea is you're supposed to take a day off work and you're supposed to get out there and have a day off, aren't you? But the fact that the government has it on the first Monday of May rather than the first makes that difficult for people.
And I think it's also like you see this with a lot of holidays, that were popular holidays, though holidays are demanded by popular action, if you like. You see they become sanitized. There's a phrase I use, like minimum safe distance. It's like the further we get away from it in time, the more we can sanitize it and put it in a box. And in the case of literally on 2 occasions in the last 5 or 6 years in the UK, we can just pretend that it's not about Labour at all with a small L, but it's actually about VE Day and the Second World War and things that the contemporary press is happy to talk about. So no, I think we're covering what is a more pluralistic left history, as John says, getting beyond the Stalinist take on it and the affiliation with the Soviet Union. I'm thinking actually this came out of a mass participation struggle where anarchism was a vibrant part of labour movements around the world, as Yuri says, but also particularly in the US at this time. And one of the great ironies, of course, is when's Labour Day in the US? Labour Day in the US is actually in September. So even though this was called for in the US, and the Second International promoted in in memory, if you like, of something that happened in the US wanted to have a safe distance from it and had it in September. So it is a sort of modern tragedy, but it's also it's a kind of microcosm, if you like, of what's happened to the historical memory of anarchism in general. The anarchist origins of Mayday have been eviscerated. But then again, if you think about just British anarchism, which obviously is much smaller scale than the places that Yuri's talking about, where there's been a long heritage, even the fact of the presence of anarchists, for example, in things like, I don't know, our friend Lewis Mates talks about the Durham coalfields before 1914 or in mining action before then, that's been largely lost except to experts like him. So, recovering that history, I think, is really important.
Let's hit the present as our last topic for tonight, because we can report today that Shut the System, a climate direct action nonviolent organization, has claimed responsibility for graffiti and super glue and cable cutting actions directed against the Barclays branches and the Barclays office, and these were continuing their pressure on Barclays to completely divest from fossil fuels. Barclays has also been targeted by Palestine Action in conjunction with Shut the System for its involvement in investments in Israeli arms companies, including Elbit. Um, and I've been wondering about this dynamic for a while, because it seems to sort of come off the back of the either the outlawing or the ignoring of public protests, in a way, where the space for this kind of dialogue, supposed dialogue between citizens and government, is becoming increasingly closed, and very explicitly so. There is a way in which this kind of these kind of micro actions of sabotage are possibly likely to become more frequent, as a kind of still non-violent alternative. I mean, we're also seeing these kind of accountable disruptive actions becoming more and more weighty in terms of prison sentences that they carry. And so although we're still in a stage, in a legal stage, where some of the latest sort of even more excessive steps to clamp down on protest, in terms of what police can interpret as a protest that can be shut down, have been struck down. I mean, that doesn't mean that they can be passed again if due process is followed. So with these kind of thoughts on the current landscape of nonviolent action in Britain, I want to kind of get your thoughts about where you think this leaves the grassroots movements and activists, for climate justice and international justice.
Well, first of all, isn't it positive that this sort of thing's still happening? Considering the anti-protest legislation we've had over the last few years, that people are willing to get off their backsides and do stuff. I mean, you just have to be so much more careful, I imagine. I've not been involved with that sort of thing recently, so I can only imagine the steps that people are taking, and we have to remember that repression of protest groups is never too far away, and it is so much easier now. We had what happened at the Quaker headquarters a few weeks ago. Was that to do with a
There was
Gaza
a raid
demo?
on a public meeting of, I think it was Youth Demand, and I think it was kind of one of your usual sort of new activists come in recruitment briefing.
I
It
see.
wasn't even an action planning event, right? So that was just pure intimidation, as far as I understood.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, repression is never too far away, but the fact that people are carrying on is a positive thing. To bring it back to politics just a little bit, this is another way that Labour could have been different when they came in. They could have looked at what the Tories had done to the landscape of demonstrations and thought we could be different here. And obviously, they've chosen to keep those laws, but the fact is, we now have people who are in prison for peaceful protest, and that is an incredibly worrying situation. But when you were setting the scenery, it reminded me of the climate protests I did get involved with when I was a bit more active on Loughborough University's campus and for People and Planet. And we did a whole
This
load
was
of.
when the university came down on people for writing messages in chalk, right? It
That's
was it
right.
was
Yeah,
that
yeah. I mean, I
ridiculous.
I was living rent free on the campus at the time, and I had to make a choice about whether I could carry on doing that. because I was told in no uncertain terms, if I carry on working with people on planet, I'm going to get chucked out. So I decided to leave, basically, so that I could just carry on protesting rather than having to worry about it. But yeah, we were trying to get the university to divest from fossil fuels, and then we also did a similar kind of thing with Barclays in the town, and looking at Loughborough University's links to Barclays as well, and just put pressure on them because they were so obsessed with their image, and they wanted to be so in charge of their marketing, the university, that it was easy to actually just get them riled. But we had to be so careful. Obviously, I was so careful that I got myself thrown off campus, but we had to be so careful about how we planned it, so to ensure that most people didn't get caught by the university, because the university had it written into their kind of contract with students that they could be thrown off their degrees, and nobody did. But we had to be planning it accordingly, and I just feel as though I wonder whether there's that sort of mindset as kind of entered the
Probably more when it's about jail time.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just a matter of not having a degree, although you know how much that means to an 18, 19, 20-year old. So, protesting on campus was a big thing for some of them,
Just to come in on that, I think, going back again to Yori's point earlier about the Blair in the 2000s, and to the point you're making, John, specifically about the legal sanctions that are now available. Clearly, what we're seeing in the last few years under the Tories is a step change. This offence of conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, causing a public nuisance was a thing before, and they could use that quite expansively. And obviously, there were lots of things after Pace in 1994. But conspiracy to cause a public nuisance, I mean, the Quaker meeting that you make reference to, but it's suspicion of people having a conspiracy to, it's the most elastic definition you come up with. But to go to Yori's point about the 2000s again, to go back to Blair, it was under Blair that you had some incredible clampdowns on what, others would call civil liberties, in terms of, for example, obviously the ID card scheme was mooted, but actually the protest zone around the Houses of Parliament, if people remember, Brian Hoare, the peace campaigner who was in Parliament Square, and they brought in this legislation, I think it was tagged onto the 2005 Serious Organised Crime Act, which was weird. But there was a section in that which said, well, within a mile of Parliament Square, within this defined zone, you have to apply for a permit to protest. And apparently this whole thing was to get rid of him. And he won a case to say they couldn't get rid of him because the protest had started in advance of the legislation coming. And of course, legislation got to be retrospective. But that then meant that they were able to be very draconian. And we started to see that, didn't we, after Labour. So in a way, if you're saying that now, the Labour are benefiting, if you like, in their right-wing turn from the Tories' protest legislation, anti-protest legislation. The Tories benefited from it in the coalition periods from Labour's anti-protest legislation because they came in, and then they had the student fees riots and all that sort of stuff in 2010, and they come down very hard on those as well. And just to try to bring it up to a kind of broader perspective, I have this kind of glib analogy that I use, which is probably not original to me. I'm sure somebody else has come up with it. But I see Labour very much as HR, right? It's the HRification of society, right? The Tories are the owners, right? Labour are HR, and that means Labour are basically sorry to HR, but not really, because I despise HR as an entity. But the HR is basically a vapored space that does what it's told and just obeys order. That's their idea. We just follow a certain set of rules that were handed down to us, and we do this stuff. And so this comes back to the point about management. These technocrats that are supposedly in charge of Labour, they probably have a kind of allergic reaction to protest because they think about the Iraq war protests, they think about that sort of stuff, they think about the legislation that's brought, and then they think, oh my God, this is not what you do. Their idea of protest is a very, very stage managed Pride protest, for instance. And speaking to somebody who's in the community, who's queer himself, there's an adage we come out with that, the first Pride was a riot. And with the clampdown, obviously, on trans people and on queer rights as well, you might see more of that too. So going back to your point, John, sorry for my rant, going back to your point, John, no, I think it is really positive that we're still seeing this happen because, people are invested, people are committed. And I take my hats off to them, as I have done before, because, it is a huge commitment in the current climate. Sorry for rant, guys.
No, I think that was a good rant. But considering Keir Starmer's history, though, as a barrister, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? Some of the people that he's defended, have have not been that sort of protest. They're not being kind of polite and nice about it. So, you know, there is a change there within Keir Starmer. I feel he's like a chameleon, isn't he? And
That's
um,
just what happens when you become a professional politician.
yeah, yeah,
you know what?
I know
You
that.
have to trade in your conscience at the door. I mean, it's you know.
But it's amazing the process that you go through, because it's not like how do I describe it? The process, we're witnessing it in real time, aren't we? And it's kind of still breathtaking for me sometimes, because I try not to be quite as cynical as that. But I do agree with you.
Well, not to put a cynical point on it, but like, I mean, I don't know how widely known this is here, but like, I think it is known. Like, I used to be a parliamentary political advisor for one of the parties, so I think that is known in my dark days when I was on the dark side before I saw the light. And the thing I would say is, like, without, like, you know, I totally agree with what Yuri says. Genuinely, I think the issue is you're like a frog being boiled slowly. You know, in terms of, or a lobster, but whichever animal it is that gets boiled slowly and doesn't react. I'm not going with me analogies or metaphors, but anyway, point being. If you join this system, like let's take the most benign, naive view you could possibly take, right? And you know, I was a young staffer, became political advisor, ended up speechwriter, did all this sort of stuff. Well, you know, I'll just put that clause in because they've requested it, because actually the broad thrust of this speech is okay, and I think it's getting us to where we need to be, and we've got to buy off these people with this, and we've got to do that. And very quickly, and this is the whole anarchist critique, isn't it? You get alienated from the people that have sent you there, right? And you start to operate in a bubble, which you do. And you start to have more in common with the people you nominally oppose in Parliament because you're having lunch with them, for instance. You're in a bubble. You're literally in a bubble in the kind of securitized world of Portcullis House and the Palace of Westminster. And then you get to a point where, and I remember this hit me very powerfully, and I won't go into too much detail because it's a personal story, but it hit me very powerfully when someone I knew was hit by an explosive device in Iraq. And it hit me very powerfully because they were serving over there. Obviously, we should never have been Iraq. I protested against all that stuff. But the point was, they were hit by that. And I was obviously working for then the Liberal Democrats. And it came to me that, like, I thought, well, the Lib Dems at least have been good on Iraq. You know, they'd had the right policy, they'd been against it. And I was a Lib Dem, I was an advisor within the Lib Dem cell to one of the MPs, Charles Kennedy. And I raised this with a number of people in the party that this had happened. There was still an ongoing issue with Iraq and all that. And basically, Iraq had got stale for the Lib Dems the minute the 2005 election was over, because it was a great issue for an election. I'm not saying for a minute that there weren't plenty of Liberal Democrat activists and voters and whatnot that weren't principled and didn't have an issue with it. It's just that politics moves on, and this gets to Yuri's point. The point of parliamentary politics, once you're in it, is to win, right? And it was no longer a winning issue in, say, 2006 when this bomb went off than it was in 2005, right? Do you see what I mean? So I think, you know, even taking a kind of charitable interpretation to it, the just the acculturation, the acculturation of the way behaviour is and the way in which you just get changed by the system inevitably means you have to reject that system, I think, if you're going to affect real change. But that's just that's the Damascene conversion, if you like.
But I think it's also the case that the people involved with changing as politicians don't necessarily know they're changing. They don't see it like we see it. So they don't necessarily realize that. And I think I was a civil servant in the Home Office at the same time that you were advising politicians. So we've both come to anarchism. I'm not sure exactly when I would say I became an anarchist, but the Home Office certainly helped. But you know, we've seen things from different perspectives, and I certainly noticed how in government people just because politicians are under attack every time they say anything. I think they get to the stage where they can't work out which thing is the most important, because everything they say gets attacked. Everything is criticized. Every day there's a media story that's horrible. And so, you know, they sit there wondering what on earth to do. And so, you know, there are things going on in their heads that we can't possibly really fully understand. I'm not giving them an excuse. I'm just saying that we need to work out the reasons, as well as having the anarchist critique that we've got. If that makes sense.
Whether we are unraveling parliamentary politics from the top or celebrating grassroots politics from the bottom, the Anarchist News Review will always be your front seat to the apocalypse. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. John Bigger, Mike Finn, This has been the Anarchist News Review from Freedom Press, freedompress.org.uk, freedomnews.org.uk. Follow us, subscribe on Telegram, on Blue Sky, on Facebook, on Instagram. We're not on X and we're not coming back.